Hi everybody, I'm Sidney McKinnon, MD and CIO of Cadiz Asset Management, and welcome once again to another one in our series of all things fixed income. I think today I'm going to talk about an economic event or an event on our economic calendar that happens once a year, but it's quite pertinent to our financial markets as a whole, not only our fixed income markets, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the financial budget that was tabled by our finance minister on the 25th of February 2026. And I just want to relate that budget to the fixed income environment, more so in particular. But let's first talk a little bit about it in general, and then we'll delve into the pertinent factors or the factors that will influence the fixed income environment in particular. So what is a national budget? Why do we have this thing called a national financial budget? But it's effectively what it is. It's the government's financial plan to govern the country's finances, or make use of the country's finances, or assemble the country's finances. So effectively, a budget has got two parts. The first part is your income part of it, which consists of revenue, and of course, maybe even borrowing, but it's the income side of the budget. And then there's another side called the expenditure side. In other words, the spending, what the money is going to be spent on. So very simply put, like any budget, any financial budget, you've got an income component and you've got an expenditure component. And that's exactly what's being done when the national budget is tabled and delivered. It's delivered in Parliament, and I think it's a lot more sophisticated than a simple budget of income and expenditure, because it gives us a window into the thinking of the way in which our Treasury and our Finance Ministry is going to be handling our finances, not only from a retrospective point of view, but also looking ahead, because what has happened in the last year will obviously determine the way in which we go forward. So first of all, a budget is this financial plan that the government has in order to receive or get income and also spend it. The national budget is also done over a medium term, what is termed the medium term. So it is there, and the planning is done at least for the next 3 years. So if you read the budget speech or you listen to the finance minister, he will be talking about the medium term and that 3-year time horizon. In this particular budget, if we look at the income side of the budget or the revenue side of the budget, I think one thing that stood out for me over the last year in particular, it was confirmed in the medium-term budget policy statement the suspicions were confirmed, and then once again now confirmed in the budget, is that we've had big inflows or revenue collections as a result of the commodity price boom that we've seen recently. So a lot of the corporates and mining houses that had to pay taxes, had to pay elevated taxes because of the price of the commodities increasing by so much. And this provides a very lucrative revenue collection stream for the government. We know that this is cyclical and it won't last forever, but it did give the ministry and the government a bigger leg up, for want of a better word, to pull in the necessary resources, get that income in, and then be able to use that in the way in which maybe they could not plan before. It gave them leeway in the way in which they could plan. Now, having said that there's these good collections from the resources, commodity boom, and then also there was good VAT collections coupled with a tax collection agency such as SARS that's been operating very well in terms of its efficiency. Then certain things could be tabled in the budget for going forward from a tax perspective that could provide a bit of relief for the taxpayer out there, such as, for example, the tax brackets. We are perhaps familiar with the tax brackets. Depending if you are paying income tax, those tax brackets were adjusted for inflation, which was not done last year or the year before, which is quite a clever way of actually reining in more taxes for the government. But this time around, there's been relaxation, so the tax brackets have been adjusted for inflation, which means for you and I that are paying income tax, there may be a little bit of relief, or at least relief in terms of keeping up with inflation as far as our income tax or our income is concerned. Then, of course, there was retirement fund deductions that were increased as well, and the tax-free threshold on tax-free savings has also been pushed up. Now, I can speak for everyone on these details, but I think the point that I wish to make is because of the tax or the revenue collection that has been so strong, the budget or the government has now had the opportunity to provide certain relaxations on taxation, whether it be on a corporate level or on a personal income tax level. Which leads me to the topic of funding, because a government cannot exist without or solely on taxation, because that's one of the main sources of income for a government. And we're talking about the income side of the balance, the budget at the moment. But it also relies on funding. In other words, it needs to borrow out there in order to do in completeness what it needs to do for the country in terms of its infrastructure and development, for example, and providing the necessary critical services that should be provided by any government for a sustainable economy. From the funding perspective, I think this was quite interesting and quite pleasing. And here I related directly to the bond market, because a large part of the funding that gets done or that the government relies on is through the bond market. And remember, this is part of the fixed income chat that we are having. And this time around, they said, because the collections were so good, we don't have to fund as much as we anticipated from the bond market. What this actually means is that the laws of economics start coming into play, supply and demand. So you have less supply in the bond markets that the government is going to be relying on, which means the bond market then has slightly higher demand or more demand, and it means yields drop, and it means the prices of bonds go up. We've seen that immediately when this was tabled in the budget. But of course, the bond market very sensitive to things like that, very sensitive to the fiscal framework, which is also outlaid in the budget, and maybe I'll talk about it in a second. But overall, it was good for bonds from that perspective. Now, having spoken about the income side of things and the funding side of things, there's also the expenditure side of things. In other words, what is the government going to be spending the money on, and how are they going to be spending it? I think, just broadly speaking, there's been a lot of savings interventions that have been set up, and these are starting to provide quite tangible results. And they've gone through quite a bit of, quite a length to try and bring efficiencies back and discipline back in the way in which expenditure gets done. I think there's been a big cleanup in government, for example, finding ghost workers within the government employ, a concerted effort to get into intervention as far as the municipalities are concerned. We know there are issues there in terms of municipalities being operating on an efficient level. So from that point of view, it's allowed the expenditure to be a lot more disciplined and a lot more efficient in the way in which funds are being allocated. Having said that, though, there's a big push to expend on infrastructure in the country. So we've seen a 20% increase in that allocation. So a big push in terms of getting infrastructure, and here we're talking everything from housing to water and sanitation and the like, to providing decent transport mechanisms and the like. There's a big push in terms of government because it's recognized as an area that needs attention. And this comes to, if we take the income side of the budget and the expenditure side, it comes down to how that is being adequately managed. And often the term fiscal consolidation is branded about, but merely what this means is that the way in which, especially the expenditure side of the budget is handled efficiently, because the government doesn't want to rack up huge amounts of debt that it cannot repay. And at the moment, we do have our debt pressures in place. We've seen our debt as a percentage of GDP rise over the years, and it's projected to peak this coming financial year. And our bond market, once again, when it heard that initially in the budget, it wasn't too happy about it. But then, of course, when it understood that there's going to be less bond supply, we saw some strength coming through. These are some of the technical details in terms of how it all fits together. But having said all of this, the budget, I think, in summary, was quite positive. There appears to be a genuine attempt and a genuine effort to implement definitively. There appears to be a definite and very much concerted effort being made to address the pertinent issues in a disciplined fashion. And we hope long may that happen. There's a long may that last. There's also a concerted effort to stabilize our debt, because, as I mentioned early on, we fund through borrowing, whether it's local or offshore. We don't want that debt to grow to levels that cannot be managed. There's a big push to ensure that debt levels are maintained efficiently. And then, of course, there's a big push to ensure that our infrastructures that are failing within the countries is being addressed through the budget process. In other words, allocation of funds and resources to actually bring those failing entities back to life, that they actually can contribute sustainably to our economy. So overall, from a fixed income perspective, it was a positive budget. We saw bond yields strengthen immediately afterwards. I think the market is hopeful, cautiously so, because we still have elements in our economy which is limiting our economy and limiting the way in which the fixed income or bonds will perform, such as muted growth in our economy. But I think there is sufficient evidence in the rhetoric of the budget to suggest that implementation of the positive issues are going to be a lot more effective this time around. So hope that helps a little bit in understanding how these things fit together. This is Sidney McKinnon of Cadiz Asset Management. Until next time, thank you.